So today marks day two of our 2-day look at the origins of the Renaissance movement in northern Italy. This whole multitude of factors that all line up at the perfect time and place to promote this explosion of learning, innovation, and knowledge. We're also at the tail end of the period going to start to delve into a little bit about some of the works of the great artists themselves, most notably Leonardo da Vinci, as well as other people that you've heard of before. Michelangelo, Raphael, Donatello. Yes, all the Ninja Turtles are going to start to get into the act here as we talk about the artists themselves and what they were doing. Now, where we left off yesterday, we talked or highlighted about how really domino number one here, the thing that kind of gets everything rolling, was the direct effects of the plague. The fact that the Black Death had hit Italy first before anywhere else in the European continent, or at least in Western Europe, that because it was first, generally the people were not really ready for it. They were not able to take much in the way of proactive steps. And as a result, fatality rates there were insanely high. That there are reports in some cities of fatality rates as high as 80%. So we see that, the society-wide effects that we see throughout the European continent are almost magnified in Italy. We see the effects there first, and then we also just see them kind of on a larger scale. And we highlighted how that was twofold, that you get kind of the change in the way that people thought. They start to celebrate life. They start to look at, existence different than they used to. All of a sudden, they're still focused about heaven and getting into heaven, but they're much more appreciative of the time that they have on earth. And they want good things, and they want comfort, and they want luxuries. Likewise, we talked about how this is where we start to see people openly questioning and verbalizing that questioning, both in word and in print for the first time. And then finally, probably the more drastic change that we see is this very rapid breakdown in the institution of serfdom, that really within one or two generations of the plague kind of blowing on through Europe, it is very difficult to even find a serf in the Italian peninsula. And again, that's just simply a result of supply and demand. You didn't have enough workers around. The workers that were left wanted better conditions. And if you didn't give them better conditions, well, they oftentimes just packed up, ran away, and somebody else was going to employ them, and somebody else was going to give them what they want. So serfdom, if you were a landowner and you were trying to hold on to that, you were fighting an uphill battle. I mean, you were going to lose your workers. By extension, you were going to lose your wealth from those harvests and then bringing in the crops at harvest time. And so very rapidly, landowners also have to kind of just acknowledge the situation and move on. Now, where we left off then with things is that, I think the last point I made was that this breakdown of serfdom, is very positive in a number of avenues. It gives people social mobility. They can all of a sudden improve their lives. They're very, very much more motivated to work hard because they can actually see that, hey, I can then make more money or have more stuff or, farm more fields or improve my situation. But it's also super important because this is something that greatly accelerates an already existing trend in the Italian peninsula. And that was the growth of cities, what we call urbanization. Northern Italy especially has a whole bunch of small cities. And these small cities had existed dating back, to the 10, 1100s, in part because of trade internationally brought about by the Crusades. Now, I know that all of us have kind of different background knowledge. Some of us maybe have learned about the Crusades or read about the Crusades before. Some of us might have no idea about the Crusades whatsoever. But to give you, the kind of quick and dirty overview of what the Crusades were for your benefit, the Crusades were this kind of series of church-sanctioned military expeditions to the Holy Land, to this area along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea, starting in 1096. Basically, you had a pope that called for this and said that, hey, anybody in Europe, anybody in Christendom, if you, kind of put down everything and you come to Italy and you get up and sign up for these crusades and you hop on board a ship. And if you're willing to go and fight against the Muslim infidels who control Jerusalem and control the Holy Land, then automatically all of your sins are absolved, that your soul is wiped clean. And if you die on crusade, that you automatically go to heaven. Well, tens of thousands of Europeans heeded that call to arms and, go and they fight in the First Crusade. And in the First Crusade, the Crusaders are actually successful in conquering all of this territory that you see kind of over here in this like salmon color on the map. They end up carving out a bunch of small, what we call today, crusader states, so kingdoms of their own. So you had like the kingdom of Jerusalem, for example, which was this Christian kingdom that existed for about 2 generations. Okay. Now, part of the reason why the First Crusade was successful was that the Muslim peoples over in the Middle East were all fighting amongst themselves. There was no unified front in their own right. And what we then see is that by the Third Crusade, so 1189, all of a sudden those do manage to unify under the command of a great Muslim leader by the name of Saladin. And maybe you've heard of him before. And so Saladin then is going to drive out the Europeans in the Third Crusade. They're going to retake Jerusalem. But, the importance, and again, why I bring this topic up whatsoever, is that from that time period of the First Crusade to the Third Crusade, you have 100 years here in which you had Christian kingdoms on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. Those Christian kingdoms were surrounded by mostly enemy states, people that they did not really get along with or that did not want them there, or that they were constantly fighting. So they constantly had to be resupplied from European Christendom. There was constant ships going from Italy over to the eastern shore of the Mediterranean back with more men, with more weapons, with trade goods, whatever. So at a time period, in the middle part of the Middle Ages, where international trade was still very minimal and very sluggish, the Italians were kind of leading the way in overseas commerce. And, the other kind of really important side effect of this, other than the fact that, okay, you get a bunch of people that are merchants and are making money, is that we also see an influx of new ideas, of new knowledge from the East, of technologies from the East that then make their way into Italy, either directly or indirectly, that the Italians benefit from. One prime example of this that I put up here on the board, if you're looking at this and you're like, okay, what the heck am I looking at? This is a basic illustration demonstrating what we call crop rotation. Okay, many of us are familiar with crop rotation. It's like, basic agriculture 101 nowadays. Like, if you have a field, you never want to plant the same thing in that field year in and year out, because certain plants leach certain nutrients and vitamins from the soil, and there's other plants that actually put stuff back into the soil. Okay, so let's say, for instance, I'm a big backyard gardener. Let's say I plant the same kind of tomatoes in my little garden plot every single year without adding fertilizer, without varying it out whatsoever. What's going to happen is eventually, those tomatoes are going to leach all the necessary nutrients out of that soil. And as a result, each year I'm probably going to get less in the way of crop yield. So I'm going to get less tomatoes. Maybe my plants are smaller. Maybe more of them end up rotting or having, issues with disease and deficiencies of nutrients. And then eventually I'm going to get to the point where my seeds are no longer even going to be able to germinate. And I'm not really going to be able to grow anything, and that land is going to become useless. Well, that's really kind of how people farmed in the bulk of Europe, during the Middle Ages. You'd have these serfs, and the Lord would tell them, hey, you got to grow barley on that field. Okay, next year. All right, you're growing barley on that field. Okay, next year. Barley it is. All right, next year. Hey, one more time, barley. And they would just keep growing the same thing over and over and over again, because that's what the Lord wanted and that's what he was selling. And the yields would go down, and eventually then that plot of land would become useless. So harvests remain fairly stable. Populations by extension remained fairly stable because there wasn't enough food to go around. Well, all of a sudden, you had something that was commonly practiced in Roman times. It's not like this was some great eureka moment. Like, this was something that people had been doing throughout the world and had been knowledgeable of for thousands of years. Yet Europeans weren't doing it. The Arabs were doing it. People in North Africa were doing it. It was just a matter of having somebody teach it to the Europeans and then bringing it home and adopting it themselves. So it's something that pays dividends. Other things I always bring up as well. Europeans, again, really not overly knowledgeable of most topics during the Middle Ages. The Arabs, however, were really advanced in terms of especially their study of mathematics and understanding of things like geometry, as well as their understanding of human anatomy. I mean, it was pretty much acknowledged that Muslim doctors over in the Middle East and these Crusader states were far superior to their Christian counterparts. So all of that knowledge kind of flows in through this Crusade trade, which is going to benefit these Renaissance thinkers later on. Now, again, kind of back to my central point, though. Okay, so we get this growth of these pre-existing cities because the breakdown of serfdom, the Crusades trade. Well, why this is so important, and really the linchpin of all this, is it results in a drastic growth of the merchant middle class. Now, again, merchants had always existed. Like any society is going to have their merchants, people that buy and sell, right? But during the Middle Ages, merchants were a fairly small percentage of the overall population. They were there, but they didn't have much power. They didn't have much influence. They definitely didn't make like a ton of money. Well, now you have, with the growth of these cities, a larger number of people that have significant disposable income. I mean, these were people that, because they were not nobles, could not own vast tracts of land. They could not have titles. So it's like, okay, I got all this money, but I'm kind of like, I'm kind of limited on what I can use my money for. So what am I going to do? I'm going to do the same thing that rich people have done with their money throughout human history. I'm going to reinvest it to make more money. So, hey, if I see like a new invention that looks like it might pay off and create more profit for me, sure, I'll give you the upfront money to get your idea started. And we also see that people use it to show off, right? The status symbol part of it, so whereas, nowadays, okay, I'm going to go out and buy that fancy sports car. I'm going to buy that McMansion on a hill over in Fox Chapel. Back then, it was, hey, I'm going to commission a really fancy statue out front of my house. Or I'm going to help fund, a super fancy church, and everybody's going to know that I paid the bills for it. Or, I'm going to build myself like a really nice, fancy, palace or house. It's the middle class that is funding all of these inventors and thinkers and artists. Without the money, the rest of the stuff doesn't happen. Without the money, Leonardo doesn't become Leonardo. Because those guys are motivated by profit. They're only doing the crazy great stuff that they're doing because somebody's paying them. And that somebody is the merchant middle class. So again, what this kind of highlights, and this is the part of history that I've always enjoyed studying. Why am I so into history? Why have I always been interested in it? I like making these connections. What this shows us is one of these, what I always call like a universal truth, like these lessons that we can glean from history that are as true in the 13 and 1400s as they are true now in 2020. So I put here universal truth number 2 of the year. People are highly motivated by money, right? We are all willing to do all sorts of crazy stuff if that dollar amount is right. We're willing to push ourselves to the extreme. And if you doubt that, it's like, okay, could you go run a marathon right now? Probably not. If I gave you $20, would you be motivated to go run a marathon right now? Probably not. I give you $1 million right now. Would you go run a marathon right now? You might die trying, but I can bet your butt that you're going to get up and you're going to go do it. people are motivated by money, and much of the progress that we've seen over the past 600 years has been very much profit oriented. Another one of those universal truths that I failed to kind of highlight, but I guess I harked on a little bit in our lesson the other day about, the Middle Ages and the Catholic Church, is that this whole thing about knowledge is power, right? Knowledge was power. That's why the church had total dominance of all things. They were the only ones with knowledge. As we get into the Renaissance, all of a sudden other people have knowledge. These merchants have knowledge because they got to know facts and figures. They got to keep accounts. They have to be literate. And so all of a sudden we see the merchant middle class starts to have significant power and authority too. It's not just the nobles and the clergy anymore with a seat at the table. These people are paying the bills. These people control the financial resources. Now, probably the preeminent example, of just the power and the influence of the merchant middle class during the Renaissance is a family called the Medici family. The Medici, I forget if I mentioned it yesterday or not, but the true epicenter of the Renaissance movement in Italy was the city of Florence. I mean, Florence was where everything was at. All cultural trends kind of started in Florence and radiated outward from there. Anybody who was anybody was in Florence. The same way that today, anybody that wants to be a great actor, you go to Hollywood, right? Anybody that wanted to be an artist or a thinker or whatever from anywhere in Europe went to Florence. And why? Because you had numerous super wealthy families like the Medici that were just great patrons of the arts. They were constantly spending their money on artwork and architecture and paying for public buildings. Why did the Medici do this? Okay, why was Florence where it was at? Well, in Florence, you actually had a system of government where you didn't have a king. Instead, it was a republic of sorts. And they had this council, and, there were seats at the council, and you had to be elected. Well, the Medici understood that, if they went and they built some, beautiful church that all people of Florence could use, and if they did it with their own money, but benefited everybody, that the people of Florence would love them. And if the people of Florence loved the Medici, then they were very likely to vote the Medici and their political allies into this governing assembly. So, the Medici, they loved artwork. They loved artwork even without the politics. They funded it even with but they also had that political angle to it. I put here, so this is just a picture of one of the Medicis. Well, I think this is Lorenzo, was his name, Lorenzo de' Medici. Over here, a picture of the Medici palace. So, they lived as opulent, if not more opulent, than many of the members of the traditional nobility. These next few slides are just some pictures that I took when I visited Florence a number of years ago. And Florence, today is still a beautiful city. But what struck me is the amount of just, again, beautiful buildings that dominate the skyline that were all built, 600 plus years ago in the context of the Renaissance with merchant middle class money. So the main one there, I had you guys read that passage about the Il Duomo Cathedral in Florence. So there's the Il Duomo Cathedral, dominates the skyline. And the Il Duomo Cathedral, what I always thought was amazing was that guy Brunelleschi, that designed the dome for this. So nobody could figure out how to come up with a dome design for hundreds of years. They started building this church. It's a massive church. But they couldn't figure out how do we get, a roof over the span. And in the Middle Ages, the answer was like, oh, well, let's just pray on it. God will provide eventually. Well, as we get into the Renaissance, church is still not complete. And all of a sudden, the Medici and some of these other super rich merchants say, okay, praying's not working anymore. Let's pool our money together. Let's hold a contest, winner takes all, and let's see who shows it. And Brunelleschi literally comes out of the woodwork. Just some random dude. And he's like, hey, I got some ideas. And when he builds this dome, it literally remains the largest dome structure on Earth built by humans until the Superdome, where the New Orleans Saints play, was built in New Orleans in like the 1960s. Again, profit motivated here. People do crazy stuff for money. So again, just some pictures of some of the palaces in Florence, along the Arno River. This is a really cool bridge in the background. I don't know if you can tell, but it's a bridge and it's covered. And then there's shops that literally hang off the side of the bridge. And a lot of these shops are owned by the same merchant families, goldsmiths and jewelers and whatnot, that literally opened those up, during the 14 or 1500s. Again, another beautiful bridge that dates back to that time period. And then you go into kind of the middle, in the heart of Florence, and they have just these, huge, plazas where you just have all of these beautiful statues on display. Now, the statues, the vast majority of them today are replicas, and oftentimes the originals are actually in a museum also in Florence, but they're, safely protected from the elements. But if you would have been walking around, in Florence circa, 1500, again, you would have seen authentic, original, great sculpture pieces from this era just out there for anybody to lean up against, for anybody, stick their bubble gun under, Michelangelo's David's heel there, bird droppings all over. Like, they were just out there for everybody to view and enjoy. So this is just a picture from the center of Florence, and you see the mass of humanity. This is obviously not from 2020, and you just see all the sculptures there in the background. Another one, and if you're not sure, well, what the heck's going on in this one? This is a depiction of the story of Medusa, that famous story from Greek mythology. I always forget the name of the guy that does the slaying. Maybe you remember, but so again, just the kind of stuff that was very indicative of this time period. And then this I thought was always really neat. So this is a building called the Baptistry. So this is a building that had one purpose in Renaissance Florence, and it was a place to baptize the children of the city. So anybody is born, okay, you're young, you're baptized, that's where they're doing it. And then you have the Il Duomo Cathedral in the background, and just the cost of this. I mean, the entirety of both of these buildings is made of nothing but white, green, and red marble. So marble here in 2020 is super expensive to use in construction and building of homes and building. Back then, where you were transporting everything via river or oxen-drawn carts, I mean, the cost of this must have been, in the modern day adjusted, hundreds of billions. But again, that shows you the impact in the emergence of this powerful, wealthy merchant middle class. So again, just a few pictures of Il Duomo and the opulence. These doors, likewise, these are all one solid bronze door each, and they depict a bunch of biblical stories that were all carved, and then they poured the molds. These doors they similarly did a contest with, to see who had the best design, and the guy that ends up winning it and building these doors took him something like 22 years to actually finish this work. But he had 22 years because, hey, he was getting paid a lot of money to produce this. And then just get a few more. This gives you a frame of reference. There I am, standing next to the side of the old Duomo Cathedral, and you just see kind of the enormity of it. And that's a picture of it in the inside. So anyway, you get this, kind of domino effect, plague, change in mindset, breakdown of serfdom, acceleration of the growth of cities, emergence of the merchant middle class, money that can then fund the thinkers and artists to do the great things. And then the cherry on top of all of this. And this is just an example of where timing is everything in history. It's like you got these perfect conditions and you got one more thing that just lines up. You also, during the late 1300s and early 1400s, get this just massive influx of thinkers and documents from the Byzantine Empire. Byzantine Empire being the last vestige of the old eastern part of the old Roman Empire. So when I had highlighted the other day in that lesson about the origins of the Middle Ages that, oh, Rome falls in 476. Well, the Western part of the Roman Empire falls in 476. Rome itself falls in 476. All that stuff in Western Europe gets destroyed and eradicated. But the eastern part of the Roman world holds out. The eastern part isn't overrun. The knowledge of the Greeks and the Romans remains in the libraries and universities of Constantinople. And it remains there all the way until 1453. Now, in 1453, you get the eventual conquest. I don't know why I couldn't think of that word. The eventual conquest of Constantinople by the Ottoman Turks, the Ottoman Empire. Specifically, it was a guy by the name of Mehmed the Great who comes in and takes over the city finally. And, one thing I bring up is that, people at the time were very aware that, hey, the Ottomans are going to take Constantinople. It's going to happen. I mean, this map depicts politically things on the ground circa about 1400. And you notice it says Ottoman Sultanate, and it's already taken over most of what is now Turkey, as well as a huge part of like Bulgaria, Greece, Serbia, those countries in southeastern Europe. Well, if you look carefully, you'll see there's like a small little thing here of like salmon color. That's the Byzantine Empire circa 1400. So everybody knew it was only a matter of time till that was going to fall to the Ottomans as well. And what oftentimes happens, when things kind of start to trend really, really bad, is that oftentimes your best and your brightest people, oftentimes your people of means, people with money, are oftentimes the first people to get the heck out of there. They look around and they're like, oh boy, stuff's getting real. Maybe we should leave. And then they have the money to physically get out of there. Look at somebody like, an Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein looks around in, 1930s Germany, looks around at what's going on, and he's like, yep, I'm not staying. I'm out of here. But we see the same thing with a lot of these Greek Byzantine scholars. Constantinople's going to fall. Pack up all the scrolls, put them on a ship. Let's skedaddle. And where do they go? Well, they're not going to go in this area. This part's going to get overrun too. So they come up here and they cross the Adriatic and they flood into Italy. So again, you have this perfect alignment of factors where you have all these people thirsting for knowledge, and then it's like, okay, boom, right in your lap. Here's a bunch of books for you. Here's the writings of Ptolemy. Here's the writings of Aristotle. Here's the writings of Socrates and Plato and all these great thinkers from antiquity. Here, enjoy. The timing is absolutely perfect. So, universal truth number 3, because man, we are on fire today. We are laying these on. It's something I think I highlighted, I think the third day of class when we were having our little discussion of that NASREAM article. Is that diversity is good. Cultural borrowing is good. And it typically promotes progress. And here's a prime example again, that we see this with the Crusades. We see this with the collapse of the Byzantine Empire. Now, again, circling back to kind of my previous point, one of the things that you cannot ignore about the Renaissance, and if you've ever viewed any Renaissance era artwork, heck, you just did with some of those sculptures, is that you look at the quality of the pieces. And especially you compare it to the quality of the pieces from the Middle Ages that were being produced. And we'll look at some more examples probably in a day or two in here, side by side, Middle Ages versus Renaissance. And again, you can't look past the fact that, like, wow, they get much, much better in a hurry. Like, man, those people in the Middle Ages really couldn't draw well. And all of a sudden, man, they are painting just these fabulous masterpieces. What we would still consider some of the greatest pieces of artwork in all of human history. Well, again, why is that? It's because these people are now specializing. If you were an artist during the Middle Ages, again, who had money in the Middle Ages? The church, the nobility. And, Were those people really interested in artwork or, no. The only people that were financing artwork whatsoever was church officials. And even they weren't doing it overly much. So if you were an artist, well, you were actually something else. Like art might be a side gig. You might make a few extra bucks here and there, but that was not your primary occupation. And what was even more common was that really the only people that were producing artwork were, again, monks and monasteries. So we see as a result, talent levels were very low. There's not really any major gains in techniques. Well, all of a sudden, you get the influx of money in play, and the fact that this money is being, handed over by, merchant middle class people. And all of a sudden, these artists have an incentive, right? Hey, if I want to get the job, if I want to get the commission to paint something for that guy, I need to up my game. It's basic competition, right? I'm going to one-up him, and then this other guy's going to one-up the next guy. And so we see quality increase very, very rapidly. The other thing that we see is that, if you were one of these people that were the best of the best, almost overnight, like you could become, basically the equivalent of like a modern day millionaire. These guys were rich. These guys were the celebrities of the age. And then, to take it one step further, a lot of these great Renaissance masters that, were in high demand and were getting paid big time money and were producing great stuff. Well, they figured out ways to then even multiply their profits. So to give you an example of what I'm talking about here, so you'd have somebody like, like a Leonardo, probably best example of this, where he would open up like a workshop. Okay, he'd open up a big workshop. He'd have like a big warehouse and it's not like it was Leonardo. If he would get commissioned for painting, he wasn't the one that was painting every little last brushstroke of every little painting. Instead, he'd get the order. Oh, well, I want to buy a picture of the Last Supper. And Leonardo would maybe come up with the idea. He'd come up with the design, and then he would have an apprentice maybe working for him. Maybe as a fairly new apprentice. And so you'd say to the fairly new apprentice, okay, I want you to start off. Your job is to just kind of work on the background a little bit. So the apprentice would do the background. And then when he was done with the background, he would maybe then hand it over to a more seasoned apprentice. Somebody that's been there maybe like 4 or 5 years. Okay, you're now responsible for kind of shaping out where the human forms are in the foreground. All right, and then that guy would hand it off to maybe a more journeyman artist that's working in the workshop, and that guy would add a lot more of the color and detail in, and then finally, maybe after like 4 or 5 people had kind of drawn on it, all of a sudden it makes its way over to Leonardo's easel, and he'd put like a smiley face on Jesus in the middle, and boom, done. It's a Leonardo. $1 million painting, priceless. That's how these guys operated. They were very shrewd businessmen in a way. Now, because these guys were, again, celebrities in high demand, had tons of money, what we see is that most of these great artists and thinkers of the era didn't just stop with like one area of study or one area of expertise. Instead, they would dabble in pretty much everything. I'd paint, but I'd also sculpt, and I'd also, do mathematical equations, and I'd also, do anatomical sketches. Why? Because they had money. Therefore, they could buy time. They could buy assistance. Therefore, they could do whatever they wanted. They could dabble in a bunch of different things. If they got bored, they could switch to something else. We see the same thing all the time with people in our modern age. You get the 65-year-old, former CEO. He got lots of money. He retires, and it's like, okay, I got all this money on board, so I'm going to start collecting sports cars, and I'm going to take up golf, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that. And before you know it, he got like 8 hobbies. The Leonardos, Michelangelos, Donatellos, Raphaels, etc., did the same thing. I mean, again, Leonardo is the best example of this. And today, by the way, we still, if you ever come across somebody using the phrase Renaissance man, if they refer to you as, Billy, you're such a Renaissance man. That's a compliment. This phrase Renaissance man in modern English literally means somebody who's good at everything. Somebody that has a lot of areas of expertise. He's smart and he's good looking, and he's the captain of the sports team, and he's artistic, and he plays the violin. That'd be a modern day Renaissance man. Well, Leonardo, again, the prime example of this. Leonardo was somebody who was born as the illegitimate child of an unmarried woman in some rural peasant community. So he was born as a free peasant. But his mom was literally kind of the lowest rung of society. She was almost an outcast. Here you are, this bastard child. But because he was born at a time when serfdom had died out, hey, I don't want to farm. Gravitates over to Florence. Shows a knack for learning. Somebody somewhere along the lines, we don't know who, recognizes the fact that, hey, this kid's special. Takes him in, gives him an education, puts him to work as an apprentice. And before you know it, Leonardo's starting off, has a workshop of his own, is creating masterpieces. By the time he died, Leonardo was recognized as being the best person in Florence, the preeminent expert in Florence in the following disciplines: biology, sculpture, linguistics. He spoke 7 languages, music, architecture, painting, and botany. I can't imagine being considered the best, amongst my peers in one thing. Can you imagine being the best person in Allegheny County at something? Leonardo was the best in 7 or 8 different things. Leonardo was one of these guys that, for fun, would go and dig up corpses and dissect them in his house just because he was curious. I came across these Arab medical texts and they show all this stuff. Let's see if it's really there. Highly illegal. But he did it because he could. He had the money. And frankly, nobody was going to move against Leonardo. Even if people were aware, nobody wanted to mess with Leonardo because he had powerful friends and he had a lot of financial wealth. Leonardo, one of the famous things about him is that he loved to just invent stuff on the side. He loved to just doodle all the time. When you look at some of his sketches and the detail and kind of the physics behind some of his ideas, and it is absolutely amazing. Some of it is hundreds of years advanced if he would have just actually sat down and created a prototype. This is what I'm talking about when I say, a Renaissance man. There's some of his anatomical texts. Dabbling in everything, good at everything. So to close here with today's lesson, what I want you to do, and I think that this is something really neat that I stumbled across. I had the tech guy the other day push out to all of you on your app or on your iPad an app called Google Expeditions. I don't know if you've ever seen it before. It's one of these kind of neat VR-based apps, and there's all sorts of free stuff in there, especially if you have a VR headset that you can kind of mess with. So if it's not on, you might have to go into that manager tab and then click to download it, but you should see it there. Okay. So I want you to download that, open that app up on your iPad, and then you'll see you go to the main page and there's a search bar. I want you to type Da Vinci's inventions. Okay. And you'll see there's this little thing that you can kind of download then for free about Leonardo da Vinci's inventions. I then want you to open it up. Okay. And I want you to choose the view in AR, and then I want you to play with it. I mean, it's pretty intuitive. It's pretty self-explanatory, but it's really neat. And what it lets you do is it lets you create this depiction of his sketches, of his inventions, and you can kind of walk around them 360 degrees, and you can kind of experience them firsthand. And it's amazing. He has these artillery pieces that he comes up with. He comes up with an early version of a helicopter. He comes up with an early idea for a tank. I just want you to have this neat experience, while you're sitting at home, because otherwise we'd be, if we were at school, we'd be doing this all together, kind of walking around the classroom together. So I want you to do that. And then finally, when you're done kind of messing around with that a little bit, go ahead and click the Google form exit ticket under today's date. And there'll be just a few brief questions about today's lesson as well as the experience with that app. Okay, so we're going to stop there. In our next lesson, where we're going to pick up with this, is we're going to talk about then, okay, so you have all these people specializing. You have all these, professional thinkers and artists. Well, what we see during the Renaissance then is that certain techniques kind of emerge, that certain themes and genres become very commonplace, in terms of these rapid changes. So tomorrow we're going to start to take a look at those, and we're going to continue looking at those over the next few days. Okay, so nice job, and I'll see you when we are live next together.